Hello everyone. Thank you all for being here. My name is Tyler Menzies, and I'm going to be talking about video games and how they relate to surgical performance. So the question you might be asking is why? Why video games and why surgery? Well, to answer the first question, it's actually very easy. I love video games. In fact, I might love them a little bit too much based on images like this one, and this one, and these three, and it gets worse, and this one. And yes, that D stands for days. But why surgery? And the answer to that is this. This was actually a study that took place in 2002 and came out in 2007, and was pretty much the first one to report a distinct relationship between surgeons who played video games in their spare time and an increase in surgical performance. It cited that surgeons who played more than 3 hours a week of video games outside of their surgical practice time had 47% fewer errors, performed 39% faster, and performed 41% better in score metrics than individuals who did not. Now, this was limited by when it took place and the small participant group, but I decided to conduct a study observing these effects more in depth. And what I did was a meta-analysis. And what a meta-analysis is, for those of you who might not be familiar, is I take a bunch of studies who have observed what I'm looking at, so the relationship between video games and surgery, and I take the data from those studies, and I collect all of it, and I condense it down into one paper. I use certain statistical analysis programs to get new data that's reporting on the collection of that data. And so my meta-analysis looked at three distinct areas pertaining to the relationship between video games and surgical performance. I looked at active gameplay, which was surgeons and surgical trainees, medical students, people like that who played video games in their spare time in addition to their surgical training. I also looked at virtual reality simulation, which is individuals who practiced on surgical simulators, which were designed to emulate the surgical experience and how that pertained to their performance. And then lastly, I looked at historical gameplay, which is individuals who have a history of playing video games, who might have played video games in their adolescence or their childhood, and how that affects their initial performance on laparoscopic simulator tasks. My independent and dependent variables for this is actually mislabeled, so excuse me for that, but my independent variables were individuals who, as I said, played video games as practice for surgery, who used virtual reality simulators, or had a history with video games. And my dependent variable was continuous across all three independent variables, and it was observing their performance on surgical simulation tasks. And so my hypothesis in general was that there exists a statistically significant positive relationship between video game play and surgical performance. As I've said up to this point, the collective kind of opinion across all of the research has been that there exists a positive relationship, and they're actually moving forward with research under this assumption, but there has yet to be a paper or data that quantifies this assumption. So I wanted to collect all this information and come to a scientific conclusion that this is indeed the case. These are the results from my experiment as I analyze all of my different studies. These are a bunch of complicated numbers, which probably don't mean a whole lot to you, and that's fine. But to condense everything fairly comprehensively for you, for game training, so for individuals who played video games in their spare time as a way of training or in supplement to their training, we saw statistically significant moderate effect in the results, meaning that there exists a present relationship between video games and surgical performance. For VR training in situations where surgeons were training on surgical simulations, I saw a large statistically significant effect as a result of that, which is more effect than the game training, which represents some significant difference between virtual simulations and game models. And then for gaming history, we saw a statistically significant small effect, which may be some sort of artifact of data collection or sampling bias, or it might indicate that individuals who played video games in their past did have some sort of cognitive and intellectual changes that caused them to perform differently on initial laparoscopic training. This is a graph visualizing this with 95% confidence intervals. And as you can see, the bars for the middle one, which is VR training, it might be difficult to read in the back, are larger, and that's because the number of studies that I selected pertaining to VR training were smaller, and thus I have less confidence in that reported statistic as compared to things like game training or gaming history. For my conclusions in future research, I conclude that that my preliminary analysis is strongly indicative of some degree of positive effect. So I feel that my research on this matter has done well to quantify the assumptions in the research up to this point, and offers a good kind of foundation for future research in the topic of video games as it pertains to the training of complex tasks, especially surgery. I recommend additional meta-analysis, which would include a number of things like wider study sampling and more extensive data collection. One large limitation of my study was the fact that I had a significant sampling bias based off of what was available to me through my data collection and research. VR gaming is here and ready for research. That's interesting, as some of you might know, that people wear, there's gaming where people wear headsets and can look around and see things, whether that be putting your phone in a cardboard box or buying a $600 piece of equipment in order to do so. And surprisingly, there's very little psychological research actually delving into what this means and what this does to the brain and how this affects the individuals using it. So I think that that's a very lucrative and high potential area of psychological research going forward. And anecdotally, gaming as a warm-up to complex tasks such as surgery or other performative tasks may provide some benefit, whether or not that is linked to the actual video games or whether that's linked to something like the Mozart effect in cognitive arousal would need to be parsed through future research. But I wanted to add that in there because it's potential that's another domain of potential gaming benefit. Future directions from a more general standpoint, I outlined 3 of them here. I think the expansion of simulation training within medicine and technical fields is a valuable way forward. The current system is good and it's improving fairly quickly, but I think given the research up to this point, it would be very valuable to expand simulation training for surgical trainees especially, because you're dealing with real people whose lives are at risk, and the more that we can practice and the more that we can solidify those skills prior to actual operation, it does a lot for the safety of the individuals involved. Research on the effects of VR gaming and simulation immersion training. As we approach realistic digital environments, there's a lot of psychological research to be done there, as I stated before, so that'll be very interesting. And then lastly, the application of games and game theory to a wider range of learning domains. Current education doesn't take full advantage, I think, of digital technology, video games, and simulations and things like that. So I think if we design and implement digital simulative technology into classroom settings, that we have the potential to revolutionize modern academic education for the benefit of our children. Thank you. Yes.
So you talked about one of the weaknesses of your study was perhaps a sampling bias with available research available to you. Can you give us a sense of how many articles you initially screened, and after all of the processes you went through in screening those, how many studies entered into your meta-analysis?
Yeah, so I started out with 544 articles, which I surveyed across 3 different search databases. And I condensed those down to 21 articles, which gave me enough data to properly analyze their results, totaling somewhere around 34 individual experiments within those studies. So I condensed them down, and there were a significant amount of studies that were left out, either for unusable data that I couldn't use to analyze for what I was looking for the effect size, or studies that were unavailable entirely. So as I said, future meta-analyses should seek to use those studies and kind of gather that data more effectively than I did. Yeah?
Do you recall seeing variability in effects relative to age or previous surgical experience?
I did not, and I think there were a couple of studies that did analyze age, especially with regards to gaming history, but I think a large obstacle for that would be 2 things, primarily that the selection or the study population is fairly limited amongst med students and things like that, and also when it came to the effects of this are generally limited to initial surgical training, not surgical performance mastery, and so that further condenses kind of the population of people that you're dealing with for effective results. Yeah?
Did any of the articles look at the relationship between VR training and gaming history? Because I guess what I'm thinking about is it's probably fairly likely that people who are feel comfortable in virtual reality training and gaming have maybe done that first step and sort of a follow-through effect, if you will.
Yeah, to answer that quickly, because we're out of time. Some of them used gaming history as a moderating variable and looked at that. And VR gaming doesn't necessarily look like I portrayed it. It's a little bit different. It's more just strict computer simulation at this point. But some of them use that as a variable, but I don't have any data off the top of my head on that. No. Thank you.